Yeah, right.
What are a couple of your best writing tips for us?
Well, one of the stories I used to love to tell my students was about Kate Chopin. I used to have my students write short stories. She was a writer back in the late 1800s, into the early 1900s, turn of the century. As a woman back then, they didn't really have a voice. They were treated just slightly above chattel.
Mhm.
And she had suffered tremendous loss, loss of her father, and was destitute and having a hard time, but she had a passion for writing. She could write a story. And so she did, and wrote short stories and became very famous for that. And she wasn't satisfied with just earning a living, right? She would put themes into her writing. And this is what I stress to my students and to anybody listening out there. She understood what the American woman was going through at that time, but she couldn't write directly because it would never get published. So she would take a fictional story, but put those themes interwoven into her story in such a brilliant way. And so I would have my students read and analyze The Story of an Hour, which was written by Kate Chopin. And it really shows you how you could tell a story about what a group of people are going through, just like Charles Dickens did with his stories, the plight of the poor, the orphans on the street and stuff. And just like Louisa May Alcott, the
She's my favorite, by the way,
yeah,
of
how
all
the
time.
education system, right, wasn't including minorities and stuff. And that was a passion of hers, but she couldn't just come right out and write that, right? So she had to just interweave it into her stories. And Kate Chopin was like that. So I used to tell my students her story because I wanted them to see that there's more to just writing a story about this person and what happened to this person. And then they had this big challenge and the end.
Mhm.
And that's what I always try to say. Don't just write a story, but put some themes in there of salvation and redemption and deliverance and hope. Love conquers all, whatever theme you feel that the reader needs to read, to encourage them, to get them back on their way. They might be down in the dumps, but then they read your story and there's hope. And so many women in the suffrage movement got hope from her stories because they could identify with the woman in her story.
Mm.
And even though the men reading them, they didn't have a clue, the women did, and they knew. And unfortunately, she didn't live long enough to see the suffrage happen and to see women get the vote. But she was one of those authors who was partly responsible for the change that came. There's power in words. There's power in the story. It's not by accident that God gave us his word. He's a God of words and chose that way to communicate to us, and then he created us, and we are like that too. Words matter to us, they are so important to us. So if you have a story to tell, that's great, whether it's a dragon story, or a murder mystery story or a romance, doesn't matter. I have those themes in all of my stories. And my
Mm.
students used to tell me, I know Dragon Forest isn't a Christian book, Mrs. Douthitt, but I see some of those themes. And I'm like, good, that's what I wanted you to see.
Mhm.
So I tell people all the time, yeah, I'm not an outright Christian fiction author, but you will see those themes of redemption and covenant, oath, and faithfulness and hope and love in my stories because that's who I am, right? I have to put that in there because that's part of my being. So, writing tip of the day, make sure you put those themes that matter into your stories. And that's what will resonate with your readers more than anything, more than any plot or any setting that you've chosen or any awesome character. It's those themes that matter
Mhm.
most.